Hello there. I'm John
Hi,
Ato,
John.
and this is Francis Peters. And Francis works as a counsellor dealing with people who are recovering from authoritarian cults in Holland and online. So
Yes, yeah.
and she's very good at it.
Trying to be.
Yeah.
Learning all the time.
Francis, you were what, 46 years in the Watchtower Bible Tract Society, the Jehovah's Witnesses? Is that right? 46 years?
Yeah, about 44. Yeah,
44.
Yeah. Sorry.
Sorry about that. I've given you
2 years off.
I'm thinking about Karen de la Carrière, who was 46 years in Scientology. So getting my numbers mixed up here. So we were just talking about the subject which I think we largely agree upon, which is to do with identity formation. And
yes.
I'm, as everybody knows me, knows I'm very big on Eric Fromm's work, except for the stupid things he said about homosexuals. We're not going to get into that. But for the most part, I think his ideas are sensible and worth retesting 50, 60 years later, of course. But one of the ideas he put forward is that the way that Nazism grew up in Germany was because people did not form a true identity. They didn't grow up into a self, and they had what he called a pseudo self, or pseudo identity. And we're talking about, there's a difference between the born in, which people in our field now call SGAs. Isn't it wonderful having a loaded language? You know, second generation adults, how clumsy. So born-ins, and often they're third generation, fourth generation, fifth generation. So we should have all of these micro sort of numbers. But somebody who's born into a belief system, and then that's the belief system they swim in, and that's what they have. And when they come away from that, it can be incredibly difficult to make sense of the world. I talk about my friend Carmen, who was 2 years old when her parents got into Scientology. And she was about 21 when she left, and I talked with her about 15, 16 years later. And so she'd been away from it for a long time. And she looked at me and said, John, is reality really an agreement? Which is one of Ron Hubbard's bizarre little ideas. And I said, no, if you're the hypnotist and you've got somebody hypnotized, then reality is an agreement. They'll agree with you. But otherwise, we all have our own perception of the world, and it's valid. And it was shocking to me 16 years after she'd left. But then she'd had nowhere else to go. Whereas, and often what I see is that people will return to what they believed before they became involved with the authoritarian group. And then they will grow forward from there. I noticed lots of my friends, when they left Scientology, the men largely, grew beards and grew their hair long and started smoking cannabis, you know, that it took them back to being 17 or what have you. So to grow up, to become adult is the goal. I agree with Eric Fromm that probably 60% of people never do. And I think our society does almost nothing to help that, to talk about relationship and development. So jump into that and tell us something interesting.
What we talked about was especially if you are born and raised in a group, there is a lot of difference what you can see from people if they come out of a cult and they were born and raised in it, that there is an identity crisis or an identity development not finished, as if you have to really, especially when there was a cult identity being seen as your own identity, then if that's just taken away from you, or you're stepping out, and then all of a sudden all of these questions, existential questions, and to really start from the basics, from what is true, what is not, and who am I, and how do I relate to the world outside, and it's you really have to start almost over with all of these important questions, and it makes you feel as if you're drifting, as if it's very confusing and very very scary.
And you don't realize that You know, it's the same as sort of when you see the customs and habits of people from another country, that they are foreign to you, they are strange to you.
Yeah, yeah,
But to accept that somebody has grown up with a foreign set of ideas and that they're now rejecting those ideas and going, oh no, that's not the way it is. How
yeah,
do they, and people will then, I mean, when I started doing this work back in 1983, about half the people who are involved with, you know, helping former cult members wanted to convert them to Christianity. You know,
yeah, yeah.
this
To
was not,
actually encourage them to cold hopping in one way.
yeah, and so and that they were generally selling them a much milder form of belief than they'd been
Yeah,
involved with. But
yeah,
nonetheless, you know, I had a couple who came to me and they wanted to help me. And the husband said it'd be great because this would be a way of evangelizing. And so I looked at him and said, do it just once. And that's the end. We are here, and you know, our friend Christian Churko, who, as his name suggests, is a Christian.
mhm,
You will never, and I've known Christian since 1987, you will never hear Christian trying to talk somebody into any belief, his own or
no,
anybody else's, because we recognize that that is the violation. That is,
exactly. Crossing
like,
the line. Yeah,
you're taking somebody who's vulnerable and you're exploiting them, and you probably think you're doing the best possible thing in the world for them by bringing them
yeah,
to Jesus or Allah or whoever you're bringing them to. But
mhm,
they need a cooling off period
mm,
where they're recovering from what they believed and can start looking at things. I often will recommend, of course, you know, I make a huge profit from this myself. I will recommend the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu to people who've come out of a group, unless, of course, it happens to be a Chinese Taoist group, because this is a book that doesn't demand that you believe anything. It's a way
no,
of reassessing the world and saying, does this make sense? As I say, you can buy my version of it because I translated it. It's very short and very cheap,
mm,
but it has been helpful for some people over the years because they don't then, you know, become a Taoist worshipper. That's not expected. They question it. It asks certain basic questions, and they can say, well, do I believe that or not? And of course, in leaving a group, you want to be able to say, I still accept these parts. You know, so often leaving the Jehovah's Witnesses, people will say, become Methodists or Baptists or something like that.
mhm,
They
mhm,
still accept the notion of Jesus and that tremendously important idea. That what they don't like is the horrific treatment, the inhumane and uncompassionate treatment of members that is a commonplace, sadly, within the Bible and Tract Society of the Watchtower lot. So they'll sometimes move somewhere that's, you know, and it's useful for them in their development. But I often feel that, and I've said that when you leave a group, no matter how old you are, you're 12 years old,
mhm,
because you've accepted that kind of parental authority that the group has.
mhm,
And what I would like to see is adults who have accepted ideas from others that they've tested and thought about, and that they might be willing to change based on evidence, but they have decided this is the idea, rather
yeah,
than just following like sheep and
yeah,
doing what the leader says. Adulthood is the point where you can listen to advice and say, I reject that, I accept that.
yeah.
And
But that's what one of the things that is the biggest problem is that you learn from by raising in such an environment that you are not to be trusted. So your heart,
enemy
eh,
inside you, the devil
exactly, it's
inside
that you are not to be trusted. So your own feelings, your own thoughts, your own need, not important. So
you.
and your own feelings, well, whoa, that is probably infected by a demonic influence somewhere.
Or the
So
unconscious mind, or whichever.
yeah, and the world itself is seen. So the world outside of the organization of Jehovah's Witnesses is seen as um, as demonic, as being in the hands of the devil. So you can't go there because that's dangerous, and also your own feelings, they are not to be trusted because this evil inside you is there. So how to then feel that you have a sort of an own compass that you can rely on Or so they'll tell you, well, we've got everything you need to be able to take care of yourself and to get the wisdom that you need, or the insight, or the interpretation of the Bible that's the only one that's accepted as good or as truth. So if you are raised with that idea, wow, the biggest enemy actually in my life is my own sin, or my own unreliable. I'm unreliable as a person. So that doesn't help you to get to get to that point that you dare to explore, or that you dare to rely on yourself to figure out how things, what things are. So it's often when people are out of the organization, even if they're just in that age of 17, 18, then often they find it really, really hard to connect to the society outside without just not saying it right, just from that inner sense of feeling safe in the world outside. So then it's so easy for other groups to just tap into that need that you have to get guidance or insight, or just invite you in to their group. And we talked about cult hopping before, but this is more about, okay, you have your the identity of the group you have accepted, or you might have accepted during those years, as your own, to have actually, as Marcia was talking about a foreclosed identity, that actually before you can explore identity of who you are, that they actually gave you a sort of a ready-to-go identity. Well, this is your identity.
The peg.
Yeah, without exploring or allowed to explore yourself, who you are and what you actually want. So never learned to carry responsibility or having ownership over your own choices, and just being able to rely on yourself. So you are actually the start of how to come to a decision, or tap into your own feelings and work with that, or tap into your own needs and learning to take care of them. So there are so many things that are involved that is very, very confusing for a former cult member to start with. So where to start? And that's so the problem is that a lot of cult members who were born in to that environment, that controlling environment, they are very specific challenges. But what we also talked about is people who get recruited into these kind of groups when they are in their teenage years or later are in life, they often had a lot of abuse during the start of their lives too, or just were very familiar with emotional blackmail, very familiar with abuse of authority, or domestic violence, or all kinds of control that makes it easier. It's not to say everybody can be coercively controlled into such a group, but it is absolutely easier when you had a rough start in life to get involved with this group. Then it's more of getting out of a controlling home into a controlling group.
I mean, it's said of, and you know, whether this is accurate or not, but I've often heard it said that about 50% of children who are abused as children will grow up to be abusers, and about 50% won't. And having met some of the 50% who didn't, you see very strong character formation. You see people they've not been defeated by this. There is still,
they grew above it.
there is still some resilience, and there's there's no blame attached to that, that if you've been overwhelmed by horrible behavior, then you deserve empathy and every sympathy.
Yes.
And that some people, quite by chance, it's like with PTSD, that when you're looking at the original diagnoses of shell shock PTSD, battle fatigue, combat fatigue, that at the beginning of the First World War, such people were shot. They were treated as mutineers. By the end of the First World War, some psychiatrists had put forward, Rivers being the famous one, had put forward the idea, they'd shown that these were the bravest people often, who were suddenly just couldn't take it anymore. So it wasn't a matter of cowardice that you're dealing with. It was something that was overwhelming for them, and we should never judge people for that part. I definitely recommend Patricia Crittenden's Raising Parents to understand better, to design a better response to childhood abuse, and dealing with that, as in many people, with many parents, a problem in their own adult development, that some of them really do think that this is a loving thing to do, to have a sexual relationship with your own child. They really don't realize that it's devastating and absolutely will not lead to a good conclusion. But in some cases, you have somebody who's brought up and they're born into the group, and they don't have another way to look at the world. In other cases, you have people who've been brought up in a disharmonious environment, a horrible environment. And so again, they didn't learn. It's said that by the time a child is 5, one set of responses will be dominant. Either they will think about things and make decisions about what to do, or they will react to things. And if a child has been brought up in an abusive environment where they are psychologically, emotionally, or sexually or physically abused, then that sort of old brain instant reaction, lizard reaction, do something, the lobster that Jordan Peterson likes so much. What a silly man he is. But I don't have a lobster in my head, Jordan. That just isn't. I have an integrated brain system. And the point is that if the system is integrated before you're 5 years old, then the reptile brain is not acting independently. Whereas if you've never had time to think about anything, and it takes about half a second to think about something, by the way, in the prefrontal cortex, if you've had to react to being attacked all the time, then you won't have developed the processing, or it seems likely that you won't have developed the processing to actually think about stuff and go, probably not the best thing to break that window with a baseball bat, And that's part of development. And so we see both with those who are born in and those who did not have a suitable childhood environment. And I would say that's an awful lot of children. And have not been taught at school how to have relationships, how to communicate, how to resolve difficulties, to reconcile.
So you could, what I've often seen is that when people still not get to that point that they had a sense of self or their own identity being clear to them, so this is who I am, and felt strong enough to explore and disagree with the parents or with the place they came from, with the ideas that they were brought up with. But then it is very, very important that after somebody is then leaving such a controlling environment, that they first get to that point that they really pay attention on who am I?
Who do I want to be?
Yes, and how to actually understand who I am, and really learn how to have that ownership over their own decisions, and because some of them really start to believe it's not possible, but it's that even if you're older, it's absolutely possible. But it's a more of a late, it may be later in life that you figure out who you are without the group telling you, or without the people who raised you telling you, and that you will learn how to make peace with yourself, and that to learn that you are not the enemy of yourself, that actually there's a lot of information already there in you that you can tap into, and that you often have better ideas than the ones who abused you and the ones that controlled you for such a long time. And to start to listen and hear that voice inside that actually often has really good ideas about
Yeah.
how to move on in life. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's vastly important to say
Yeah.
that until such time as you do this, until such time as you become yourself, you will not be happy.
No, you have
You
to.
will be looking to other people to reflect
Yes.
back to you whether you're doing the right thing, whether you're wearing the right shirt. This is a Principal shirt, by the way. It's a very nice shirt. And your top is lovely today, by the way. And as usual.
It's more how we go about learning to carry our own responsibility, to learn how to self-care, how to learn how to rely on ourselves, and trust in ourselves, that we building self-confidence. All of these things can sound, for people who didn't have that kind of control during their upbringing, may find it hard to understand how that should be learned later in life, but as if it comes natural, and it doesn't. So
No.
when you, so it you only, I treasure it so much, because I've had to learn later in life that I really had to go through certain very, very strong emotions, like fear, or feeling completely inadequate to take care of the basics. So even we're very reluctant to rely on myself, because I thought, well, I can never do that.
Well,
So,
remind me of a story that you told me when we first met, which was that you decided that you needed to go out to work, you needed to get a
yeah,
job. And if I remember rightly, you went to a store and said, take me on, but treat me as if I was a teenager. Treat me as if
yeah,
I don't know
yeah,
the world, which was
yeah.
a piece of self-perception. Most people would not be willing to admit such a thing.
Yeah, I was in the year I started there working when I was 49, and I asked the one, so I thought, well, I have to be open about this, because otherwise they'll find out anyway. So I said, well, I wanted to work in the restaurant. So there was a restaurant for just serving lunch and soup and coffee and that kind of thing. So it was a sort of a lunchroom in the store. And I asked to come and work there, because I said, I've got a lot of trouble trusting people, and I've got a lot of trouble to dealing with the stress of just being amongst people, and I really want to learn. So I was very open to my boss, to explain to her that I really wanted to get a grip on it, and really become stronger emotionally. So I just opened up, being very vulnerable about that, and just saying, well, I have to learn how to trust myself again, because that I felt I couldn't do, and I needed to become a counselor, doing the work that I wanted to do. At the same time, I was going back to school and going to the Academy for Coaching and Counseling. So there were a lot of things I wanted to do, but I had to get over this problem that I needed to deal with. I couldn't avoid it any longer. I needed to deal with just going through the fear, and I had panic attacks many times. So I thought, well, as soon as somebody was starting to get angry with me, I just lost grip of, and so that's when I asked even young people who were in their teenage years, who had much more confidence than I had. So girls of 17, 18 that were further on the road of being able to deal with stressful situations and people who were angry. And I asked them, can you help me? And so every time I just blocked just being in that difficult situation, they supported me and showed me how to deal with it. And I was very, very happy with their support, because they just pulled me through. And I worked there for about 2.5 years. And in those 2.5 years, I really learned a lot about also the strength that I have inside. I was never aware of. I was always told, well, you're too, you're not capable of taking care of yourself in those difficult circumstances, because you cannot rely on yourself. And then I learned, well, yes, I can. So, but I had to put myself in these difficult situations and asking for help, be open about it, in it, to be able to grow.
And asking for help is such an important aspect of this, that
when somebody
comes out of an authoritarian group, they know they're a member of the elite.
Yeah.
You know, that you can't help it. You are going to be looking down on the rest of the world. I talked with intervened with a woman who'd been 20 years in Scientology, and she was at their headquarters in California, buried in the desert, surrounded by razor wire so they can't escape. And she'd had to go home to look after a mum who'd had some surgery. And she hadn't really been away very much in the 20 years she'd been involved. And she told me that she found herself walking around the supermarket buying things, pitying all the other people because they didn't know about Scientology. So you've got this sense of superior wisdom,
feeling chosen.
Yeah, feeling chosen. And then you get out into the world and you discover that there are, as you say, 17-year-olds far more
who know better.
Than you are. So shedding that, you know, I have my problems with the Dalai Lama and some of what's going on there, but he, you know, him taking $2 million to talk with Keith Raniere of Nexium was, you know, but he's trying to support a community, you know, I know. But there's a picture of him with Osahara of Shinrikyo as well, grinning. But he did say this one thing, having been born into, well, not born into, but at the age of 4, lifted into a life of absolute privilege. He is a king who rules a people. He's the head of one of the 3 sects of Tibetan Buddhists. But one day he turned around and he said, I realized I'm just the same as everybody else. And I think that perception that you are not superior, you've got aspects of your personality that, you know, there may be things that you're very competent at, things you're very good at. There will inevitably be things that you're not very good at. Exactly. And that's the reality of a human being. And to not, you know, bloat yourself to think that you're super special, and to not diminish yourself, to think that you're just an echoist. This is meant to be the opposite of a narcissist. They're ridiculous words. Neither of them really very useful, I don't think. But people who don't want their birthday to be celebrated, people who don't want any attention, people who shrink from everything. The authoritarian cults shut people off and make them insensitive to the needs of others. Go through all of, I've just done the thing with Spike about Lifton's 8 deadly sins of thought reform, which I think are relevant to everybody. I really think they should be taught in school, because when we see these behaviors that, you know, the demand for purity, where if you don't do what we say, you are impure.
Oh, yeah.
You know? And that can be, you know, washing your feet 3 times a day or combing your hair on the other. It can be with the Mennonites, the Amish, got into this thing where the younger members are realizing that there is nothing in the Bible about which way you cross your suspenders, your braces. Not in the Bible. It's like during the time of Luther and the the translations that were coming out, well, Tyndale before Luther, that people found that there were no priests or monks in the Bible.
No.
Oh, what does that mean? There were also no churches in the Bible. There are much, in fact, I think ecclesias means a gathering of a community. It doesn't mean a building.
Yeah.
And initially in the Christian church, there would have been basilicas, which kept the bones of saints, but there were people would meet in their houses, and that would be that.
So far more simple. Yeah.
All sorts of structures build over time, or then you get an individual like Ron Hubbard, who basically spends decades just pouring out millions and millions of words, among which is a lecture where he says you've got to suspect anybody who is the only authority on a subject, and who will probably just keep saying more and more and more to make sure that nobody really understands. When I read that after I'd left,
you just zoom out. You just after a while.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
But that sense that other people are superior to you, other people are inferior to you, no. We seek to be the best person that we can be, but that does mean developing a self, which means learning that you can say no.
Yeah.
Learning you can say, the reason I don't want to do this is because I don't want to do it. And that's the end of the conversation. There's no obligation to explain yourself to the world. Understanding that you have a right to privacy.
Yeah.
That, there's this kind of 1984 attitude in some Christian sects. God is watching you all the time and he's not pleased.
Yeah.
I think
no, those words, privacy, having your feelings to yourself, and just thinking differently than the whole group does. That's absolutely foreign to me at that time, especially. Privacy, just no, because you had to tell and explain why you were thinking a certain way, and based upon what. So, and if that basis was not the organization itself or the leaders explaining something somewhere in one of these
their
books,
mistranslation of the Bible,
yes, and then absolutely, then it's not accepted. So, and then the following sentence would be, who do you think you are? That you know better. So and then immediately it feels like a slap in the face, like, oh yeah, who do I think I am actually? And so I could not ever know better. And so then you'll feel, okay, you're then seen as an arrogant person that is thinking too much of himself. Well, actually, it's the opposite. You really had to feel as if your thoughts didn't matter and your feelings didn't matter, that somebody else's feelings, needs, or thoughts were always better. So the reflex would always be, oh yeah, you would step back and think, well, what do I know? And so to take up space and wanting to, that you step into a room and feel confident that you matter as much as anybody else, that feeling was for me also in the beginning absolutely foreign.
Yeah.
Because I said, well, you just come in, just actually under the carpet. You step into a room not being visible at all. And sometimes people would just forget that you were there. But that was actually supposed to be. So that's what the result is of not even knowing who you are and not daring to take up space. And that's not everybody in a group probably would act like that, because you always have leaders in the group. And but I was not one of them.
I'm going to push a little bit here. I'm going to say that I believe that if there is any particular purpose to human life, and I'm not utterly convinced that there is, and it doesn't bother me one way or another, but if there is a purpose to human life, then the first stage is to develop a self, to understand what your tastes are, what your desires are. Let's get into a specific thing about tastes here. and the difference between people and why it's wrong to enforce ideas on other people. Our great friend Yuval Law, the first time he came and stayed in my house, I grow tomatoes. I'm well known. I grow 30 or 40 tomato plants every year. I grow exotic and strange
And
varieties.
they taste great.
Fantastic. That's what we care about.
Yeah.
And so I offered him a tomato, and he said, "Oh, I don't like tomatoes." I was like, "Don't like tomatoes? What's wrong with you?" And it came about that throughout his childhood, I found that there are two sets of foods, and both of which are repugnant to him. One is the caraway, aniseed, licorice group, that taste is horrible to him. And the other is tomato, cucumber, melon, and less than ripe bananas. And these are common, that if somebody doesn't like one of those things, they won't like the rest. And he then explained that throughout childhood, growing up initially in Israel, he would be given salads to eat, and he'd be expected to eat them, and you've got to eat this. And to him, they tasted horrible. Now,
yeah.
I think that's really vital in understanding that every human being have their own tastes, their own desires, and they have a right to those things.
Absolutely.
And that's part of becoming a self. The next objective, having formed a self, is what are you going to do with it? And this, again, I've actually been talking about this for a very long time, since 45 years now, since I've got hold of this idea. I was still a Scientologist at the time, that we each have to develop our own voice, and that when to become an artist is to do something differently. It's not to learn, you learn the technique and the craft, or not these days you don't, but you used to learn the technique and the craft of painting so that you could then express yourself. You can see this if you look at works produced by the artist Giorgione in Italy, and then by his pupil Titian, that there's a period where Titian is painting Giorgione's. And you can see this new voice developing, this new person in the last works that he did with Giorgione and the first works that he does with Giorgione. He's absolutely recognizable. Any of the great painters, Rembrandt, El Greco, Velázquez, Monet, Kandinsky, you can recognize them from a long distance away because their set of colors and shapes. And that's not because they went, what would everybody like?
No.
They went, what do I like? So that's the development of the self, and your artistry, whatever that artistry is. It can be being good at conversation, it can be knitting, it can be cooking, it can be anything. As you develop your own voice, so you develop a self, you develop your own voice, and that becomes you. And the joy that you will take from making things, and the joy that those people who appreciate what you make, because not everybody will, because some people, if you make them tomato soup and they don't like tomatoes, what are you going to do? But you will be more appreciated, and you'll be better at what you do, and you can develop competence. And to me, that's adulthood, that's growing up, and it's not what our society is interested in. Our society is interested in keeping you in the teens, so you'll always want to buy more stuff, despite the fact that we've got to save the environment. Oh dear. So I think this is the essential question, not simply of authoritarian cults, but of human society, that getting the best out of people in a pro-social way, so that what they're doing will help society, but be governed by the individual and by their own choices.
And you can perfectly well connect with other people, because I know that a lot of I don't know exactly, but that there are numerous former members who told me, well, it feels so selfish if I only focus on my own individual development. And I said, well, it is because you have to first connect with yourself and know who you are before you can connect with other people, because who are they going to connect with? So if you don't have any idea of who you are and how to rely on your own compass and get a sort of just as a rooted tree, just feel strong in knowing who you are and being your own best friend, then how can you connect with other people just respecting each other's boundaries? So to have a safe connection with another person, being able to set your own boundaries, you have to know who you are first.
Mm.
So it's not about being selfish. It's about taking care, being able to self-care
And I think it's
self-rely.
It's worth saying that you can't actually be unselfish until you have a self.
Exactly.
And
Yes.
what we see instead,
Yeah.
I just made a hostile comment about the word narcissist because it's an absolutely wrong word. Narcissism, I'm going to do this again. Havelock Ellis, the British psychologist in the 19th century, grabbed the word narcissist from the story of Narcissus and Echo, this lad who ends up in love with his own image in the pond.
Yes.
Havelock Ellis quite correctly defined this in psychological terms. He said, this is somebody who does not wish to have sex with somebody else. That's what it means. And you go, yeah, it does mean that. This is somebody who therefore will masturbate and be sexually self-obsessed. He felt that was probably a problem. Sigmund Freud comes along and says, no, narcissist is somebody who loves themselves to the exclusion of all others. Eric Fromm, who's studied Freud, says, oh, he's wrong about that. What he's calling a narcissist, Ellis is right. What Freud is calling a narcissist is not a narcissist because they do not know how to love, so they do not love themselves. Now, I have a hesitation over the notion of self-love. That's always seemed to me maybe a bit too much, but self-liking, I can deal with. So what we see in narcissists is people who want to be adulated, they want to be loved, but it's because they haven't formed a complete self. And so until you've formed a complete self, you're either a malignant narcissist, the dangerous kind, or a benign narcissist, the kind of David Bowie, Freddie Mercury, Elton John type, people who lived desperately unhappy lives, wanted to have adulation. And I don't know about Freddie Mercury, I don't know enough about him, but I think for both Elton John and David Bowie, they developed a self. And that benign narcissism, which had made them go, look at me, look at me, look at me. And when you look at their early careers, particularly Bowie, the things Bowie tried, he was a folk singer. He sang chim chimney, chim chimney, chim chim chiree. He did all sorts of nonsense, desperate for adulation, and he talked about it. He said the ground control to Major Tom was about him and his sense of isolation because his parents paid no attention to him. And then you hear interviews with him when he's in his 40s and he's got through the cocaine period in Berlin and all of that. And you hear a guy you'd like to sit and talk with, who's actually really interesting because he's thinking about things. He's no longer caught up in the look at me, look at me, look at me. So I think it's a process we all have to go through. It's a matter of how long it takes. And it's probably, to some extent, an incomplete process. Even when we die, we perhaps become adult in some ways and not others. But then adulthood must include that willingness to be helped, that willingness to depend on others, which is perhaps the last phase of it as we go into our dotage.
Yeah, it's about
as rapidly as possible.
When somebody's a teenager, it's all accepted that they focus on their own development and trying to explore and doing a bit dangerous things or just trying things out. And everybody, society accepts that. But if you're in your late 40s or in your 50s and you're trying to do that, then people look at you, oh my God, what are you doing? So then it comes across as a bit,
I'm having a midlife crisis. What do you mean? What am I doing?
As a bit strange. What are you doing? And you don't know yet how you think about this or that. And it's ridiculed, but it still is a very, very important phase. You have to go through. You can't skip it. And that is maybe, that is of course comes across a bit silly that you have to start doing that and start to explore and figure out what you want, where you base your choices upon, etc. But it is necessary to do. It's necessary to go through, and you will benefit from it. So if you keep avoiding it, it will keep chasing you until you do. So
that is the idea that we repeat our mistakes until we've learned from them. which is kind of backwards and the wrong way around. We repeat our mistakes until we decide that we don't want to make those mistakes anymore.
So we have to stop finding it silly ourselves, but understanding it's because of the place that I grew up in that I'm now have to do this. It's just, it's inevitable. It's a sort of a emotional development into wanting to know, getting to know yourself and wanting to know who you are and that you're okay as just being you. That's fine. And there's a lot of things that people have inside, a lot of gems that people have inside that they haven't discovered yet.
We're here to develop our competence. I wrote a novel about it called Voodoo Child's Slight Return. It basically, it was a silly idea. The idea was to bring Jimi Hendrix back to life. So I read 14 biographies of Jimi Hendrix and listened to all sorts of stuff that it was only just becoming available he'd played, came to know him very well, brought him back to life, because I wanted to explore the concept of the crossroads, which is the fundamental idea in the blues. We're told this story over and over again. Even Eric Clapton has told this erroneous story that Robert Johnson, the great Robert Johnson, went down to the crossroads and the devil tuned his guitar and after that he'd play and he gave his soul to the devil. This is an absolute nonsense. The story was told before Robert Johnson by Tommy Johnson, who was not related to him. He did know him. He grew up around Tommy Johnson. He probably heard the story there. Johnson himself in the song Crossroads says, fell down upon my knees and asked the Lord above for mercy. So no devil involved. But it's such a lovely story that people want to retell it. And I wanted to look at that notion of the crossroads. Why is this so important? Because we're always at the crossroads. We're always able to change our direction. The other thing that it seemed really vital to me to talk about in this novel, which is, it's a caper, it's got all sorts of stuff going on in it. One of my readers even said it was scary, which I hadn't thought about. Me. But this thought that everybody, no matter their intelligence, their intellectual competence, everybody has talent. Everybody has something that they can do well. And to make a great society, you let people do that rather than our current educational system, which suppresses creativity for the most part, suppresses difference and wants to create uniformity as if such a thing were ever possible. But so it goes. Well, I think we have kicked this idea around a little bit, and
we did, didn't we? Yeah, just a little bit of how we think about it, and it's just okay to, even if you need to start doing it later in life, because life just, that's the way it goes. That's the way it went. So okay, if that's so, it's not too late to just give it the attention it needs and learn to self-care.
In fact, start doing it right now.
Yes.
Thank you. Please do comment, question, what have you. Do try and pick up on comments. And I do like the idea of a community of learning rather than a kind of knowledge coming down from the mountain to
absolutely.
Hoi polloi, so there's a lot of stuff I don't know yet, and we would like to hear from people. So thank you very much for sharing.
You're very welcome.
And I'm John Atack, and my lovely friend Francis Peters. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.